How many strategies does settler colonial denial use to justify taking indigenous land? This is a powerful question, even if it is an unpleasant one to ask. It helps us understand how indigenous peoples have been systematically dispossessed and marginalized. These are not just remnants of history, but ongoing tactics used to justify the appropriation of indigenous lands and resources. They are interconnected, as each strategy can blow oxygen into the other ones, creating a complex system of denial that continues to impact indigenous communities today. This video essay will unpack a number of these attitudes and provide historical examples to show how they have been used to harm indigenous peoples. We will explore the interconnected nature of these maneuvers and examine the ongoing effects of these denial strategies on indigenous communities. We will highlight indigenous resistance efforts and current reconciliation movements. Understanding these maneuvers is crucial for everyone. It helps us recognize the ways in which settler colonialism continues to shape our world. By confronting these harmful narratives, we can begin to dismantle the systems of oppression that they uphold. This is essential for achieving true reconciliation and justice for indigenous peoples. The first strategy of denial is the most blatant, claiming that indigenous peoples never existed in the first place. This strategy could be called negationism and was used to justify European colonization by asserting that the land was unoccupied and available for the taking. One of the most well-known examples of this is the British colonization of Australia. British settlers arrived in Australia and declared the land empty, despite the presence of Aboriginal peoples who had lived there for tens of thousands of years. This denial of Aboriginal existence allowed the British to claim the land as their own and to systematically displace and dispossess the Aboriginal population. This strategy of denial is particularly harmful because it seeks to erase the very existence of indigenous peoples and their histories. It lays the groundwork for further injustices by creating a narrative in which indigenous peoples are seen as non-existent or irrelevant. This erasure has had a devastating impact on indigenous communities, leading to the loss of land, culture, and identity. The second strategy of denial acknowledges the existence of indigenous peoples, but argues that they did not have a significant presence in a particular place. This strategy often involves downplaying the size and complexity of indigenous societies, or claiming that they were nomadic and did not have a strong connection to the land. In North America, for example, European colonizers often described indigenous peoples as small, scattered groups of hunters and gatherers. They ignored the sophisticated agricultural practices, complex social structures, and vast trade networks that characterized many indigenous societies. This narrative served to minimize the perceived value of indigenous lands and to justify their seizure by European settlers. By denying the extent and significance of indigenous presence, this act of denial reinforces the idea that indigenous peoples did not have a legitimate claim to the land. It sets the stage for further dispossession by maintaining a false dichotomy between civilized settlers and primitive indigenous peoples. This attempt to justify dispossession is particularly insidious because it allows settler colonial societies to maintain a veneer of legitimacy while continuing to perpetuate injustice. The third strategy of denial acknowledges the existence and presence of indigenous peoples, but argues that they did not use the land in a way that warranted legal ownership or protection. This strategy frequently presupposes that Eurocentric notions of land ownership, which prioritize private property rights and the commercial exploitation of natural resources, are universally applicable. The Doctrine of Discovery, a legal principle used to justify European colonization, is a prime example of this excuse. It asserted that European Christian nations had the right to claim lands inhabited by non-Christian peoples. The Doctrine of Discovery argued that indigenous peoples did not have a concept of land ownership because they did not improve the land through agriculture or resource extraction in the same way that Europeans did. This type of denial is particularly harmful because it invalidates indigenous relationships with the land. It ignores the deep spiritual, cultural, and ecological connections that indigenous peoples have with their territories. This justification allows settler colonial societies to maintain the illusion that they are developing or improving the land, while in reality they are often exploiting it for short-term gain at the expense of indigenous peoples and the environment. One recent example is the Norwegian Supreme Court decision of May 2024 in the Karas Jock case. The Supreme Court asserted that it was not the Sami people who owned the areas they inhabited, but the Crown and therefore currently the Finnmark estate. The fourth type of justification attempts to rationalize the injustice indigenous peoples face when colonizers argue if they lost what they had, perhaps they never deserved it in the first place. This line of reasoning is often rooted in the concept of might make right. Historically, it has manifested in the hegemonic thinking of Christianity and later in justifications rooted in social Darwinism. Today, no official institutions voice that justification, but it is alive in underlying assumptions, not to mention the darkest corners of folk racism. The fifth type of justification is to assert that the indigenous people lost their land in war or lawful conquests, fair and square. The justification that indigenous people lost their land fair and square through war or lawful conquest hinges on the outdated principle that military victory equates to land ownership. This concept, rooted in colonial ideologies and international law of the past, legitimized the seizure of indigenous territories by colonizers. It often intertwined with the Doctrine of Discovery, which asserted European dominance over non-Christian lands and peoples. Despite being legally discredited, this justification lingers in biases and prejudices. Historical narratives often glorify colonial progress while minimizing the violence inflicted on indigenous populations. This creates a subtle bias that favors the colonizer's perspective and undermines indigenous land claims. Assumptions about land use also persist, with stereotypes portraying indigenous people as less deserving of the land due to perceived backwardness or inefficient practices. The forced removal of the Cherokee Nation in the 1830s exemplifies this. Despite the Supreme Court recognizing Cherokee sovereignty, President Andrew Jackson ordered their removal, leading to the Trail of Tears and immense suffering. This act demonstrates the devastating consequences of applying lawful conquest to disregard indigenous rights. However, modern international law, notably the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, rejects this justification. It affirms Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, cultural integrity, and lands. This shift signifies a growing recognition of historical injustices and a commitment to upholding Indigenous rights. The sixth type of justification is to claim that even if the land confiscation that happened was unlawful, now time has erased the tracks of the unlawfulness and replaced them with a legal and political status quo. Everybody is used with the current situation, and it is no point in stirring up the convenience of a situation everybody knows to handle. This line of thinking confuses the distinction between the perception of time for a human individual and a people. 100 years can be a long time for a human individual, but a blink of an eye for a people. This strategy demands from the Indigenous peoples calls for moving past historical injustices, labeling further discussion as disruptive or reverse racism. This tactic often appeals the need for unity and progress, claiming that we are all family, both colonizers and the colonized. This is attempted while dismissing the ongoing impacts of colonialism on Indigenous communities. This perspective can be seen in arguments that focus on economic development or national unity, while downplaying the need to address historical wrongs and their continued effects on Indigenous peoples. Characterizing somebody else's loss as minor and insignificant is often easier. Move on, don't cry over cakes we ate a long time ago is a justification that serves as a tool to erase the past and claim the present. The seventh justification is that the settlers start to claim that they are Indigenous. This strategy undermines Indigenous identity by erasing distinctions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The implication is often that specific Indigenous rights are diluted. In settler colonial societies, decades of assimilation policies have made Indigenous identity challenging to define in rigid administrative terms. Forced resettlements, boarding schools, and the imposition of non-Indigenous legal frameworks have all contributed to this ambiguity. This ambiguity can be exploited by adversaries seeking to weaken Indigenous self-determination, often through strategic self-indigenization or legal challenges to Indigenous governance. A striking example of this occurred in Finland, where a We Are You attack targeted the Sami parliament. Non-Sami individuals seeking to gain voting rights and influence Sami political affairs claim Sami identity based on distant ancestry or cultural affinity rather than recognized community belonging. When the Sami parliament sought to uphold its right to determine its membership criteria, the Finnish administrative court ruled in favor of the challengers, effectively overriding Sami self-governance and imposing external definitions of Sami identity. This ruling was later condemned by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which found Finland guilty of violating Indigenous rights and engaging in racial discrimination by failing to respect the Sami's right to define their own members. The claim We Are You attempts to merge identities, often ignoring the unique histories and cultures that have been overshadowed. It's a subtle yet powerful way to rewrite history. We could keep counting also after this seventh rationalization. But let's wrap up and ask what Indigenous peoples can do Confronting denial is the first step towards reconciliation. Fortunately, there are decent and rational people among the settler colonists, but it is not easy for them. It requires acknowledging past wrongs and understanding their impacts on the present. Embracing reconciliation involves an honest dialogue, a willingness to listen, and a commitment to justice. Only through this process can true healing and unity be achieved.